Welcome to Withdraw Consent. I'm Jack. Today I want to talk to you about BRICS. So BRICS is kind of like an economic union between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So it started in 2009 and it was just BRIC. And then in 2010 they added South Africa, so that's why it's BRICS. And so basically why they started is because this is the group of countries who were unhappy with the post-World War II global world order. They just didn't like it. And if you look around at a lot of the stories that say I cover on this channel or just things on the news, they're not wrong. They're not wrong. Like that things could be done in Libya like they did, and that nobody is strung up for that. There's not even any guilt put on. Okay, whatever. But you could go to Sudan now. You could go to Palestine now. You whatever. The West, terrible at foreign policy. Terrible foreign policy. Okay, and so immigration, just everything across the line. And so I kind of feel them on that. And basically, what I found out was that this alliance is much more informal than certain political commentators would have you believe. They talk about BRICS as if it's really this thing, and it's kind of not a thing, really. It's kind of like these four countries just kind of met to do like a meeting, and then another country came the next year to the meeting, and then everybody just said, hey, look, it's a thing. And then they were like, okay, man, yeah, it's a thing. And so they kept doing the summits every year. And even at the summits, there's this kind of like feeling that they're trying to pretend like BRICS is a thing when it's not kind of really a thing. So then they say, okay, well, now we're at the summit, so we got to do something productive so that people recognize us as a legitimate kind of union here. And so then they come up, they do these bilateral agreements, and then they agree to do these joint naval military exercises and stuff. And because they end up doing those things, it then becomes something significant that's happening, because they wouldn't have come to those bilateral agreements if they weren't going to the fake meeting, kind of, but which is not a fake meeting now because they're doing the bilateral agreement. So I think it's kind of interesting to look at like that. But it's definitely overhyped as being a more solid thing than it is, even though it is a thing. So it's definitely informal. It's mostly economic. It's somewhat political, and it's definitely not military. It's not like military alliances or defense pacts, stuff like that. They can have those separately, but that's not inherent in the BRICS model. And so the BRICS model is kind of modeled after the G7, but it's just not the same. So let's see the stats on it. Basically, they represent, these five countries represent 20% of world trade, whereas the G7 represents 75% of world trade. That BRICS represents 40% of the world's population, with the two most populous countries being among the five, of course. They represent 35% of the global GDP when measured by purchasing power parity, or PPP. And so 35% of the global GDP under that measurement, whereas the G7 is 30%. So less purchasing power, more total trade. So anyways, there's a couple of things where BRICS is going, and one of them is expansion. And so there's kind of this thing that people talk about where there's like 22 countries have like formally applied. But then the question has to be asked, like, how do you formally apply to an informal grouping? And especially when the story comes out that like Morocco is one of the 22 countries that's formally applied, and they came out and made a public statement and said, we've not applied to anything. Like, so it's kind of more like, I feel like these countries are expressing interest. Like if they were invited, maybe they would say yes. When it comes to expansion, China wants to expand BRICS into add more countries. And one of the problems they have is that they feel like in the overall world that they have very few friends. And so they want to add people on their friendship list, you know, and build more relationships with more countries. So the problem is that India has under President Modi, Prime Minister Modi, the Indian position is we can't do anything that allows China to get more powerful. So even if something would be very good for India, if it allows China to get more powerful, they have to say pass on it. So India is the one who's against expansion because China is the one who's for it, obviously. And the method that they're using to kind of stall expansion is they're saying, hey, we need to meet at the next summit, and the next summit, the next summit. We need to talk about what are the requirements for new countries to become members of BRICS. which raises another problem. If you set down the requirements in writing of who can become a BRICS member, how many of the 5 original BRICS members would have fit that need they apply? Now, they wouldn't need to apply because they're already in, but it would create this conflict where it's like, oh, I'm the only country that's in that it wouldn't even be allowed. And, like if I was a future country requesting. So basically, India is worried that basically the BRICS will become the G8 of autocracies. Because you remember what happened with the G8, which was the democracies. They kicked out 8, and now it's the G7. So Russia got kicked out. So India is worried that if you add a bunch of autocracies into who aren't allowed in the G7 or the G20, and you allow them into BRICS, that one day India will be the Russia of the G7 or G8 and get kicked out. And so then they don't want that. That's what they're afraid of. Now, South Africa's in a weird position because they're the weakest country of the 5 by far, relatively. And so they like the exclusivity of being in this club. It's like the second best club in the world, or first in their opinion, maybe, but it's top 2 because there's 2 clubs like it. And they're the smallest group in there, so that they like the prestige. And so even if something would benefit them expanding BRICS, they kind of don't want to because they would lose their exclusivity. For example, in 2023, they had the BRICS annual summit in Johannesburg, and that's a lot of prestige for little old South Africa. You remember they had the joint naval exercises off South Africa a while back? That was a couple years ago, I feel. Anyway, another issue that they have is common currency. So basically, Russia is pro having a common currency between these 5 nations, and India is against it. So one of the problems is that all 4 of the countries besides China have a trade deficit with China, and that's just obvious because China's a massive exporter, and so they have problems with the currencies. If they want to de-dollarize and use their own regional currencies, the problem is China would end up with excess rupees, rubles, and other stuff, because the deficit lies there. From India's side, India is so protectionist, as we've discussed before, with their tariffs and just their entire economy, and their economy is growing very fast, that, like, for example, for me, if I was India, I wouldn't want to tie my currency with another country's currency. Because what if Russia goes off and gets in a war? What if China goes and does something crazy? What if Brazil prints a bunch of money? I don't want my inflation rates to be dependent on another ruler's actions. I want it to be on the actions of my ruler, my elected representative, my whatever. You know what I mean? That's you don't want a foreign country, causing inflation in your currency. So there's this conflict there. So Russia wants the common currency. India's against it. And then another interesting thing about BRICS is that they've created, so something that's real, is they've created a bank, and it's called the New Development Bank, or the NDB. Okay? Now, one of the things I didn't know when I started researching this is that the United States has such a controlling interest. It's not like a majority. It's like 15% of the World Bank, but it's enough controlling interest in the IMF and the World Bank that the United States has veto power. And kind of like people lie and say they have veto power on like every loan. They don't really. They have veto power on some of the management things. And so they can kind of direct it somewhat, but they can't get there and micromanage. You still, if you lose favor of the United States, lower your likelihood of being able to get a loan as a country from one of these banks. So you got to, lick the boot over here of the United States to get your loans. And you might get one slid through because, again, they're not micromanaging it. So then they offer this new bank to give loans to emerging countries that can't get the loans from the World Bank or the IMF for whatever reason. And then they also want a return on their capital, of course. And then the way this bank is set up is that in the charter of the bank, it's basically set up so that these 5 countries of BRICS will always have a 55% controlling power in the bank. So they could admit 20 other countries into BRICS in the future, and it's the, BRICS 25. And those other 20 countries could only have 45% combined maximum controlling power of the bank. So that these 5 always, again, that goes back to South Africa's prestige. That's a lot of prestige. If 20 years from now, there's a BRICS 25 and it's 90% of the world's population or something, that would be interesting. Okay, so now let's talk about the recent expansion of BRICS. So they call it BRICS Plus with either like a plus sign or the word plus. And basically in 2024 at the summit for that year, which was in Russia, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, came as their first time as member states. And then early this year in 2025, Indonesia joined, making them the first Southeast Asian member. And so if you look at it, there's a lot of, it's slanting more towards Islam, you could see. But of course, the biggest ones aren't. So, and then also, so they have a status, it's called partner states, where you're like on your way to becoming a member state. So in 2023, they had taken on Belarus, Bolivia, and Cuba. In 2024, as partner states, they took Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Uganda, and Uzbekistan. And then in another class, which is observer partner states, Algeria, Turkey, and Vietnam were all invited. And so then that's where we're at with the growing of BRICS Plus. And it just looks like it's going to become something, like it's on its way. This even makes it look more substantial. Anyways, I think this was interesting. I think it was interesting to find out how informal the grouping is, but how it's portrayed by people who want to stir up a lot of internet clicks or, just, civil war threats and stuff like, drama and all that. That they kind of play this as much more formal than it is. And it's very informal. It could become formal in the future. It has been successful in the sense that these countries have increased their trade numbers with each other. And so that has caused some increased economic prosperity for them all being in it, which is kind of what really matters. And it's interesting that some of these countries, like China and India, they actually have conflicts with each other, but this brings them into a group, which in my opinion makes them less likely to break out in war because they have the lines of communication open and stuff like that. I think it's pretty interesting. I'm be interested to see where BRICS is going to go in the future, if it's just going to fade away into obscurity, or if it's going to grow into becomes an actual like a full thing that's a rival of the G7, and what will that cause on the G7 economies. I do like that there's an alternative out there because, like I said at the beginning of the episode, the post-World War II Western system sucks. It's freaking terrible. And even though I'm not on board with all the other things these people are doing, the Hindu nationalism, the communism, the different things, the wars and stuff like that, even though I'm not into those, I do like that there's an alternative. Like if you even just look at just some terrible third world country that just wants to become an emerging country and they just need a start. And then the World Bank says, no, we're not, you know what I mean? And then get a chance from that new development bank. I think there's value for the world as humanity as a whole that way. I'm kind of clipping in this ending because I got to change it a little bit. But basically, I had the flu all week. The entire family did. And so, I mean, I feel pretty good now. But it was a terrible week and the cognitive function was extremely low. So I could film right now, but for the following week. But the problem is I didn't have the mental acuity to do the research. So basically next week, there's not going to be any videos. And then coming back on the following week, there'll be the regular scheduled videos. I apologize about that, but it's just a flu. What can you do? Anyways, hope you guys have a great weekend.